Hi, my name is Dutch Thompson with MP3, Move Past Pain to Performance. And if there is one thing that I have become more and more aware of over the last 10 years as my time as a neuroathletic trainer, it's this, that people in general are terribly acquainted with their hips. They have very poor hip proprioception. And this leads to all kinds of problems in our life, and our backs, our low spine, and our sacrum, and our sciatic pain all have a lot to do with what I believe comes from the beginning of poor hip proprioception, poor hip competency. So right now I'm going to teach you one of the most complicated movements you can do with your hips to regain and attain better hip proprioceptive awareness. This is a hip hula. Go ahead and start thinking about doing your best Elvis impersonation as we talk about the hip hula. I'm going to use this bowl, first of all, to show you what I need you to think about in terms of what we're doing. So I've got this nice hip-shaped bowl. Imagine this is your right hip and this is your left hip. And more than anything else right now, let's talk about a posterior hip tilt. So if this is your back where your spine is, that's going to be a tucking down. You might have to flex your butt to get your hip to drop down and flex your core to kind of tilt and do that posterior hip tilt. And we're going to be navigating between a posterior hip tilt and neutral spine. So that's what that looks like. And we're also going to be talking about a right hip tilt versus a left hip tilt. So that's the circle components. So imagine this, we're going to tilt the right hip up, posteriorly tilt that spine, holding posterior tilt, we're going to tilt the left hip up, then go back to neutral spine before we let the left hip down. Unbelievably complicated to explain all that, but here we go again. Right hip up, posteriorly tilt, holding posterior tilt, right hip down, left hip up, go back to neutral spine, and left hip back down. One more time, right hip up, posteriorly tilt, holding posterior tilt, tilt the right hip down and the left one up, go back to neutral spine, and then go back down. And then the other way, we want to be good, proficient at going both directions. So the other directions like this, left hip up, posteriorly tilt, holding posterior tilt. We're going to set the left hip down, lift the right one up, then go back to neutral spine before we let the right one down. Left hip up, posteriorly tilt, let the left hip down and the right one up in posterior tilt, then go back to neutral spine before you set the right one down. This is such a tremendous exercise, and it feels so good on your hips. It's definitely going to increase some of the circulation. Now with my hips, I'll try to show you. I still need to work on this, but here's what we want to think about so far. It's going to be a left hip or right hip up, posteriorly tilt, holding posterior tilt, right hip down, left one up, then back to neutral spine before I set the left hip down. From the side angle, right hip up, posteriorly tilt, switch, holding posterior tilt, so the right hip goes down, left one goes up, then go back to neutral spine before the left hip goes back down. From the other side, here we go, left hip up, posteriorly tilt, holding posterior tilt, set the left hip down, right one comes up, back to neutral spine before we set the right hip back down. One more time, left hip up, posteriorly tilt, holding posterior tilt, set the left hip down, right hip up, back to neutral spine before setting the right hip back down. Those tilts can be very micro. They don't have to be huge movements, just like you saw in me. I wasn't doing a huge movement between neutral and posterior tilt, but those are important parts of the equation. That's it for now. Get your Elvis on and get connected to your hips. This is Dutch with MP3. See ya.